Hello, everyone. My name is Kent Shaw. I have a handout, and it looks like a Xerox handout, but it was actually made on a printer that could only print each at a time. So there's actually a lot of loving labor that went into this by my wife at my wife's school. So I felt very compelled to include the handout. There's 20 of them due to the labor costs. So if people could just share.
Yeah.
Oh.
We can share it. You probably noticed before that. I got one. You can actually move the, if you need the slides or.
I was just going to read off this.
Excellent.
Yes, Jade has the slides. Thanks. So you can the handout you see in front of you is kind of is the original assignment. I have a talk written up here, but just to kind of walk you through it, it's the original assignment, and then it has examples from 3 different students. Each student went through what I call the radical revision exercise in my poetry workshop. So in my years teaching poetry workshops, I've often found it challenging to offer sufficient guidance for what I call quote-unquote radical revision. Part of this difficulty comes from the inherently subjective nature of revision. I mean, no matter what, it's radical. But should a radical shift in meaning, especially as the writer views it, be the extent of radical revision? For many years, I relied on students introducing me to the revision via their final portfolio. Which of their revisions would they identify as quote-unquote radical? What makes it so radical? I'll admit, what I was personally hoping for was the extreme, because the main point of this particular revision exercise is practicing with extreme revision as one of the many revision strategies in their writing. Then 2 years ago, I arrived at Wheaton, where I was introduced to a homegrown tool called Lexos. Lexos analyzes digital text files and, among various measures, can offer what's called a similarity ranking. And suddenly, what had been an anxiety of differing expectations for the assignment, my desire for radical revision to stand in for something extreme, and students' expectations that a touch-up being radical enough for them, came a simple digital readout establishing an impersonal definition of radical. In service to this, I offer the exercise in this handout. First, students come, you can see on the handout that first students come to class with a poem they are willing to revise. Then I pair them up in class. In pairs, a partner assigns the writer exercises, or a set of revision exercises in response to reading their poem. I encourage the ridiculous and impossible in this. We're all aware these revision prompts are in service to a radical revision. The revision prompts have ranged anywhere from a dinosaur must appear in each of your stanzas. For this particular writer, she loved dinosaurs, and there were no dinosaurs in this poem, so duh. There's also, if you turn the page, you can see Fahim is right here. You can see Fahim's poem. And one of the prompts that Fahim had for his poem is that one word from each stanza needs an antonym in the new poem, which is a little more specific to the poem itself and offers kind of a different challenge. But one of the things I find very interesting about this particular prompt is that it concludes with a new poem. Right, so the radical revision is actually being phrased as not just a revision of the poem, but actually writing a whole new poem. And it's really interesting to me because if a revision is radical enough, it could actually stand as a second independent poem derived from the original subject matter. I would note how Fahim's original poem, A Villanelle, proposes this interesting congruence between celestial order and poetic form. In particular, I admire the folding which occurs in some of the repeating lines. Note then how the radical revision explicitly mentions a we that was only implicit in the first version. In fact, the pre-revision may or may not be set to a we, but when it appears in the post-revision, there is a new layer of occasion to the pre-revision poem. These two poems could easily be separate poems. They could also be 2 sections in a series contemplating the order of the universe and the order of relationship or the ordering of a year compared to a universal order that seems oblivious to a year. But anyway, it feels, the revision itself feels like a generative gesture that could actually open up the directions that the poem could take. The radical revision can be helpful for revealing an entirely new layer to the poet, or, as in Kayla's revision, which is the next one, further extending what has been said. I would note in Kayla's that there's a low distance score. So the distance here is the closer to 0, the closer the similarity is between the two different versions. The further away, the closer to 1, the more radical it's been. So with 1, I think actually being like there's no similarity at all between the two different drafts or the 2 different texts. So Kayla originally approached me asking if she could slide on an even lower number than this. According to her, she had done everything she could think of, and this is where the impersonality of the digital humanities tool Lexos shows its greatest advantage. Maybe you could call it an anti-anxiety. I understand Kayla's dilemma. How hard can you squeeze the revision out of a poem and still feel like it's maintaining its poetic qualities? As a writer, I can empathize with this. Lexos, however, has no capacity for empathy. I told Kayla she would have to return to the poem, which she did, writing an additional page. But more than just the volume alone, the writer, if you look at the revision of the poem, or the post-revision rather, you can see that suddenly, but more than just the volume, okay. The writer of the poem finds herself in a much deeper dilemma, right? At the top of the second page, it's been too long, she says. The figure of hope, which is kind of just this internalized thing before, suddenly has this outside presence, and now the writer is actually dressing up as a clown, walking through the streets, searching for other clowns like her who believe in hope. In conference, Kayla admitted this was now her favorite part of the poem. The radical revision is a problem which requires a creative solution. And yes, I think, I finally let Kayla slide on the lower number. The final radical revision represents another exciting possibility of the radical revision assignment. Anna's revision radicalized the form in a way that influenced all the poems she wrote after this exercise. The pre-revision poem already exhibits density and a tendency to point individual details to an overriding idea, right? It's kind of like this, it's a fairly abstract poem, but there's also these very particular details that give light of what this abstract idea is. The radical revision, however, exaggerates this tendency, and it opens up new opportunities in the form to complement the semantic play already operating in the pre-revision. In this case, the radical revision unleashed formal innovation and radical experimentation. All this in service to a simple number. The number for that class was 0.3, a number which we as a class all came together to decide. In Christina's and Fahim's class, we actually gamified the number beforehand. So we said whoever does a first radical revision and gets the highest number, that will be the number that we choose. And there was one particular student who had a radically high number, and all I could do was. So, in Anna's case, the exercise proved revising a poem can bring life and opportunity for invention via the ragged edges of the form. For instance, note how Anna broke up the epigraph, which is all the italicized portion of the post-revision poem. How she broke up the epigraph, and then and now it weaves throughout the poem. I would also note how the more open form allows more focus on an unusual juxtaposition, like my favorite, a librarian or a god, which is for Amy.
Probably many others in the room.
So I would argue that the Lexos similarity score, a simple quantification, offers a less fraught standard for radical revision, rather than the exercise standing in some subjective space between my expectation and the student's thought about what should, quote unquote, should be enough. The use of the digital humanities creates this measure the students find inventive ways to accomplish it. Thanks.